In recent years, I don't know why, but for some reason, Gen Zs have become obsessed with this idea of liminal spaces online, especially on TikTok. I actually really like the idea personally, someone who is so in love with horror and always likes to see new experimental movies. I've always enjoyed exploring that idea of liminal spaces, why it's so fascinating, why we have such a weird psychological reaction to that feeling.
Great concept like to play with, especially within the horror genre.
Obviously, someone has decided to capitalize on that idea, and I think that's great.
Yeah, Kane Parsons, who I think might be probably the youngest director ever. He's only 20. And that's unbelievable. And he's got, you know, an A24 horror film coming out called Backrooms.
Yeah, I mean, if there's
the trailer for
any other production company that would do this, it would be A24, and it's just so great to see them still focusing on what makes them so special. We've just seen the trailer. It's a very minimal trailer, so obviously there's not much to go off there, but just personally, I think there's so much to explore. And in a sense, it kind of reminded me of a movie called Cinema Rink.
Haven't seen that.
I haven't seen it either, but I've seen so many videos about that movie, and I actually really want to go and watch that because I think it's trying to capture that vibe of not focusing so much on characters. I think, you know, movies are so centrally character-based. Why can't we have a movie that's a bit different? And I think that's a really interesting question to ask. And I think from the looks of it, the fact that Backrooms is exploring that question is, I'm so immediately on board with that.
Yeah.
There's sometimes a movie comes along that just straight away, even just telling me the concept, I'm like, okay.
You're hooked.
Give me my ticket.
Yeah, it's got a great concept. I really like that teaser. It doesn't give us much, but I thought the voiceover was very effective.
Yeah.
And I'm there for it. Yeah. Although when I read that it was based off a creepypasta, I was a bit like, because obviously, you know, if you're familiar with internet culture, I mean, God, to some young viewers, they won't even know what a creepypasta is. I remember what those are. Yeah. These little shit posts in like Gary's mod or whatever the hell, some awful graphics, like usually a horror scare. That did worry me a bit, that maybe it could be a bit gimmicky and kind of cringy, but it doesn't seem like they're going that route.
Yeah, I hope not. Because there is something there. And a lot of these movies, if not all of them, tend to miss the mark every time when it's based on something so generic and so kind of pretentious as that. Like it's just based on a creepypasta. What does that mean exactly? How much depth does this creepypasta have? How can you explore that in a 90-minute runtime? Exactly, yeah. But there is something to creepypastas that people are drawn to.
Bloody Slender Man. How many times? Yeah.
There's something, you know, when you take the Slender Man movie, perfect example of that just not translating at all. Yeah. Terrible movie. Just fell into all the tropes. It was so lazily adapted.
Doesn't seem like this is doing that.
No, hopefully not.
Then also, great cast. I was just looking, like Chiwetel Ejiofor, Renate Reinseth from Sentimental Value.
Wow.
That's amazing. I mean, because, so young. He must have been, 19 shooting this? Like,
crazy.
I'm just intrigued.
So what's the story exactly? So he's basically just said that he finds it fascinating to explore that idea of
I think
he
made a web series inspired by, I guess, watching or playing, this mod.
Okay, yeah.
So that's what he's adapted it from.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very cool.
It's I can so see his vision, because I have many a times been on TikTok, scrolled through these weird videos and seen and found myself picturing a movie that was based around that concept. So something, for example, there's a certain audience that finds the early Wallace and Gromit years really terrifying. And primarily
Wallace and Gromit, man. Why is that terrifying?
I love Wallace and Gromit too. But something about Wallace and Gromit that people have mentioned is that in the early episodes, there's no one else around. So when Wallace and Gromit are exploring their town, they go outside. There's no cars. Right. There's no one walking, obviously, because they couldn't afford to stop motion all the people walking in the background. Yeah. So it captures this atmosphere of this really creepy vibe. Like, you're following this story, you're following these two characters, but they're in this world where no one else is around. Yeah. And obviously in the movies, you don't have that problem because you have all these other people.
And what, you asked, do I have an emotional reaction?
Yeah, you understand that feeling of obviously you're someone who loves Wallace and Gromit, so you never have that reaction. But people have mentioned that specifically about that show of just
in terms of what the fear of the unknown.
Like that feeling of seriously, I don't know. That's the question of what makes it so creepy. Is it just that idea of just being on your own, you know, or the idea of looking at an empty airport. Something about that is very weird and unnerving because it doesn't feel right.
I mean, I guess in a way, like, let's say if I was in that situation, I probably would have an emotional reaction.
Yeah,
to
or
it,
like an empty shopping mall.
Yeah, because it's just the fear of the unknown naturally terrifies us all.
And you would expect people to be there. Certain environments where all the time people are walking around, it's cluttered with people, all of a sudden it's stripped of that. There's something about that unnerves people, and I find that, like I said, someone who is so interested in trying to figure out, like, constantly what draws people in emotionally when it comes to that feeling of fear. Fear is such an interesting emotion to me. It's completely different from anything else. Like that feeling of anger or disgust or love or comedy. All those different things, to me, I just pass them off as completely different to fear. Fear is such a fucking primal. That's the word. Response. Yeah, and I feel like that is primarily why these genre movies, like, they struggle so much, because I don't think, like, I think they really need to be thought through, like, frame by frame in these movies.
Because I feel like, especially with something like Slender Man, I haven't seen it, but I imagine it's more focusing on the shock value.
Yeah,
like the visual horror. Don't get me wrong, that can be terrifying. Images can conjure up so much. Yeah. But I feel like what I'll always find scarier is psychological horror.
Right.
The tricks our mind can play on us, or what our mind can imagine, or just the way it processes information. That's will always be more terrifying to me.
Okay, interesting.
Than any gore.
Yeah.
Bloody Shelby Oaks, for example.
Yeah. I don't find gore scary either. But there are certain movies that do it really well. For example, like the Thing, that kind of stuff.
I mean, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Absolutely.
Like how gruesome that is.
Yeah,
that does it excellently.
Of course, there is that primal response from someone running around with a chainsaw chasing you, Yeah. But what I find more interesting, what I'll agree with, is the psychological things. Yeah. Like the stuff that maybe perhaps even on paper, like, don't even make sense why you would be scared from them. Because you have that you pass these things off with certain things that no matter what, your body will just get that response because it is just natural. For example, like a jump scare, you will just jump back, and that's why people hate on that particular technique so much.
I guess because we've been exposed to it so much, it's a consequence. Well, not even a consequence, but just a result of us, watching not just films, content for our generation. That's why we're so desensitized to the jump scare. Yeah. And why it's such a cliche often. Yeah. Which is annoying because when used effectively, the jump scare is a very great tool for the audience.
Not to say that they can't be done really well.
Yeah, 100%. But then because we've seen it in so many horror films, it's the biggest cliche now.
A jump scare is the simplest way of getting someone scared. And it's such a short reaction. It's the oldest trick in the book, and I completely get why it's so hated on. Yeah. But there's still a place for it, but it's all about the context of the story and how it's being used. But liminal space is something that people have tapped on, and that's something that I really love about TikTok in particular, is that we've created this space, like Gen Zs have created this space where we can actually explore like things that we didn't even know other people felt before. Like, I feel like that's what I love about social media, is that we come together and we kind of share things that felt like we only experience in ourselves, and people just say like, wow, I never knew I had the same, like other people had the same emotional reaction to me. It is really difficult to tap into that psychological space where it really works. And like sometimes you can have a concept, but when you actually take it to the screen and you, like you said, you try to expand it like into an actual story as well.
Yeah,
like,
that can go one of two ways. And I guess, the jury is still out on whether Kane Parsons has done that successfully. Yeah. I hope he has. I have a lot of, and for that cast as well. I mean, Chiwetel Ejiofor is like fantastic in everything he's been in.
There was another recent horror movie that came out called Presence. Do you remember that movie? It was, it's basically a horror movie set in this house that is haunted by a ghost, but instead of looking at it from the POV of the people in the house, you're looking at it from the perspective of the ghost.
Okay, yeah.
And the camera is essentially the ghost watching the people in the house. Now, to me, I was sold on that idea immediately because straight away I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever heard or seen anything like that before. But again, it was a movie that was really, really generic, really boring. The story was just really empty and it just didn't translate well at all. And it was just really frustrating because I knew what they were trying to capture in that movie, but it just didn't work. And yeah, it's a difficult one, but that's why I'm so deeply entrenched in the genre. I find it so fascinating. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see this movie. I'm glad you told me about it.